Hello, everyone. Welcome to Old News. My name is Laura Beth, and I am your host. And I'm so excited to present to you Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology, who's here to share the exciting discovery with us. Hello, Christian.
Hi, Laura Beth. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited, and happy Reptile and Amphibian Day.
It's a wonderful week for all of us who love herps.
Yeah. And so, we're so excited for you all to be joining us, whether you're an Old News regular and whether you are just joining us to learn more about reptile and amphibians for our museum special event. Before we really dive into our topic, I just want to let you guys know, remember to type into the YouTube chat if you have any questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. And we do have captions available. We're going to put the link in the YouTube chat to those captions where you can access them. And most exciting of all, we've got Old News Bingo. So we're going to put a link to a digital bingo card. Some of you may have printed yours out if you've registered for the program. And just let us know in the chat if you win bingo or if you have any questions. All right, so with that, Christian, tell us about these boneheads.
Yeah, so since we're celebrating reptiles and amphibians, I thought it would be great to highlight some of the brand new research on the weird and wonderful fossil reptiles that existed in prehistoric times. Um, and if we go, let's go to some slides here. So last month we were looking at sort of the other side of the evolutionary tree of land animals, looking at this group, the synapsids, and particularly ones that lived in the Permian. So synapsids, they are on the mammal line, so they include the distant ancestors and relatives of mammals like ourselves, and they were really sort of the dominant form of vertebrate life, bony life at least, on Earth at the end of the Paleozoic era in the Permian period. So things like these bernetiomorphs, like we talked about, were living in all sorts of ecosystems on land. But the synapsids, they were decimated at the end of the Permian by the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, so the biggest mass extinction in Earth history. And then when you get into the Mesozoic era, into the Triassic period, you have a different group, the reptiles, taking over. And prominent among these are this group, the archosaurs, which eventually gives rise to dinosaurs, including birds and crocodiles. And throughout the Triassic has a lot of incredible diversity, both in archosaurs proper and then this larger group called Archosauromorpha that includes archosaurs and sort of several of their extinct cousins, you can think of them. And in the wake of that, worst mass extinction of all time, there's so much empty eco space. So by that I mean that all the things that animals were doing in the Permian in ecosystems, those animals are gone, and so those jobs remain to be filled. So you're seeing a huge amount of experimentation and wild diversification in the reptile lineage in the Triassic, leading to some really remarkable looking things. So these are animals that we've talked about before on Old News. Things like the sort of vacuum cleaner headed Atopodentatus, which is a marine reptile of uncertain affinities. This platypus marine reptile, Eretmoripus, super weird long necks like Tanystropheus, leg gliders like Charovipteryx. The not figured here, but the Drepanosaurs that we talked about a few months ago, these tree dwelling sort of monkey lizards. There's just an enormous amount of diversification going on in the Triassic. And a lot of this has only been recognized in the past 10 or 20 years, as there's been a sort of a renaissance in Triassic work as more and more people are in the paleontological community are recognizing the importance of figuring out what's going on in ecosystems around these extinctions, thinking in part also about ecosystems today and the sort of extinctions and climate change that are happening in the modern realm that we can figure out what's going on by looking to the past. So like I said, there more and more of these really weird Triassic reptiles are being found. And in the past week, there's a new one to be added to the menagerie there. The fossil itself may be a little hard to figure out at first. So if you're looking at this is a plate from the paper showing the fossil. It kind of looks like a potato maybe. Um, and it's kind of just a lump of bone. It's a solid mass of bone. We can tell that it is part of a skull. There are places where the eyeballs would be, where the brain would be. We know it is part of the back of a skull, but it can be a little difficult to sort out what it is. And so this is a specimen that was collected several decades ago, actually. So the specimen has been discovered in that sense for quite a while in southeastern India, in what's called the Malari Formation, which is a rock outcrop from the late Triassic, from a stage called the Norian, which is give or take 220, 230 million years ago. So this is in the Mesozoic, but before dinosaurs have really come to dominance at this point. And it's a real mystery what this animal was. So a paleontologist from Texas Tech University, Sankar Chatterjee, first started working on this and talking about this specimen all the way back in the 1990s. So, going on more than 20 years ago now. And what he thought it might have been was a pachycephalosaur. So pachycephalosaurs, they are by far the best known of these dome-headed or bone-headed reptiles. So this is a group of plant-eating dinosaurs. One of the most iconic is Pachycephalosaurus itself, which has one of the thickest skulls of any animal. Talking about inches of solid bone protecting the eyeballs and the brain at the top there. And Pachycephalosaurus, we do have some complete skulls for it, but I should mention that most of the Pachycephalosaur material that we have in the fossil record are these isolated skull caps. So these are fragments of these domes. And they do, to Chatterjee's credit, look a lot like this Triassic fossil from India. So if you look at some of these fragments of the domes of Pachycephalosaurs, they look a lot like what we're seeing in the Malari Formation fossil. And with Pachycephalosaurs, it also makes sense that so much of their fossil record is just the dome, because it's very easy to preserve. It has what we call a very high preservation potential. So if you're a scavenging meat eater and you find a Pachycephalosaur carcass, let's say, you're not going to break your tooth trying to crack open a dome. You're going to be eating the guts or even like softer parts of the head. So animals aren't going to tear apart the dome. If the skull is like washing away in a river and is being broken up against rocks or being worn down by wind, the dome is going to be the last part to go. So we have lots and lots of these isolated domes. And so if there was Pachycephalosaur in the Triassic, we would expect, the dome would be the part of it that we would find. But there's a problem with that, and it comes down to timing. So again, this is in the Norian in the late Triassic, and the earliest known Pachycephalosaurs are from the late Cretaceous. So this is near the end of the age of dinosaurs, giving us a 140 million year gap between the Triassic animals, whatever they are, and Pachycephalosaurs. So this is what paleontologists call a ghost lineage. That's when there should be a fossil record in that span of time, but we just haven't found fossils from it. And there are real ghost lineages. There are plenty of groups that we know they had to have been alive at that time. We just haven't found the fossils yet, especially if they are not very soft-bodied, and they have very low preservation potentials. Like there's a lot of gaps in the jellyfish fossil record, for instance, because you just don't expect jellyfish to be able to fossilize. There are some, you see them here and there, but most of their record is a ghost lineage. With something like Pachycephalosaurs, though, where they have this very high preservation potential, that ghost lineage becomes a real problem, especially given just the length involved. Like 140 million years is a huge span of time. And to give you an idea of another, what was previously considered one of the biggest ghost lineages in vertebrate history, the coelacanth, perhaps the iconic, so-called living fossil, a group of fishes that was thought to have gone extinct with the non-avian dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous, and then miraculously found alive in the Indian Ocean in the 1930s. So that's a 65 million year ghost lineage, and that was considered just like a wildly extreme ghost lineage. And so if these Triassic domes are Pachycephalosaurs, that is more than twice the ghost lineage of even the coelacanth. which is real reason for pause and real reason for suspicion that maybe these things are not, in fact, pachycephalosaurs. So what paleontologists had to ask themselves are pachycephalosaurs really the only animal that could produce a dome like this? And when you look into the broader fossil record, it turns out not quite. So let's move briefly to the age of mammals, to the Cenozoic. You have this group called the Chalicotheres, which are actually very close relatives of horses. And they had sort of horse-like skulls. These were herbivores, plant eaters. But instead of hooves, they had powerful claws. And some of them, like Anisodon here, had sort of gorilla-like proportions and would have been knuckle walking and using their powerful limbs to tear down branches. So that's one of the subgroups really of Chalicotheres. There's another one called the Schizotheres that includes this animal Tylocephalonyx. So these also had claws, but had somewhat more horse-like proportions. But some of them had very extreme specializations of the skull. And in the case of Tylocephalonyx, it includes a dome, so a very, expanded, thickened mass of bone on top of the brain, on top of the eye sockets, similar, convergent on what you see in pachycephalosaurs. So we know at least, mammals were also able to do this. If we go way back, even before the Triassic, back to the Permian, there's another synapsid group that does this. So there's the tapinocephalids. This is a group of early synapsids, so non-mammalian synapsids that also evolved domes and horns on the skull, incredibly thickened the top of the skull, what's called pachyostosis, which just means thick bone, which is another thing I think we talked about with the Bernetiomorphs last month. So a lot of these therapsid groups, these early synapsids, do have thickening of the skull. And as you can see in that restoration on top of the tapinocephalus itself, some of them had very prominent development of the dome. So what we see looking through time is that the domes are not unique to pachycephalosaurs. Dome-like structures, sort of boneheadedness, if you want to put it like that, has evolved convergently a number of times in vertebrate history. So is it possible that these Triassic domes are a fourth different instance of domeheadedness? And the support for that comes from another fossil that was described a few years ago. So this is an animal called Triopticus. So not from India, but from the similar age, also late Triassic, from Texas, actually. So this is also a skull cap, sort of just at the top of a dome. And to try to situate yourself a little bit here, here's where the eyeball would go under that massive bone. And here is a very speculative, but informed reconstruction of what Triopticus might have looked like. Again, we only have the dome, so we don't know what the snout or the lower jaw really looked like. But this is, probably not too far off. And what Triopticus shows is that these are not pachycephalosaurs. These are actually a much more what we might call basal or primitive. I mean, they're specialized in their own way, but they're very far removed in evolutionary history, not only from pachycephalosaurs, but from dinosaurs in general. So they show a lot of the features of earlier archosauromorphs. And it turns out that the skull caps from India are very, very similar in a number of characters to Triopticus. So in the past week, the Indian fossils were finally described as a new species, Cranosaura cuttei, which the genus name means helmet lizard, which seems appropriate. Cuttei is in honor of the Indian paleontologist T.S. Cutty, who first discovered these, who first collected them. And together, Triopticus and Cranosaura, they were put in this new grouping of a fourth convergent lineage of boneheaded animals in prehistory, which they call Protopkynosians, which roughly translates to the original thickness, or sort of like the early dense ones. But it's from ancient Greek and just refers to their relatively early appearance in the fossil record and the thickness of their skulls. So now this is part of a trend actually in what's going on in the Triassic. So it's not just like there's this pseudo pachycephalosaur in the late Triassic, a lot of the body types, the body forms, what paleontologists might call morphotypes, that you see in later dinosaurs and in crocodiles, you first see in Triassic archosauromorphs. So we think of like big armored dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus and Stegosaurus. You have these armored archosauromorphs in the Triassic as well. We think of these bipedal, toothless things like Ornithomimus. You have actually distant crocodile relatives that were bipedal and toothless in the Triassic. So there's a lot of these parallels, and Triopticus and now Cranosaura, these Protopkynosians, are adding yet another seemingly dinosaurian shape and inferred ecology to this Triassic lineage. So again, this is part of that incredible experimentation in body forms happening among Triassic reptiles, which were quite successful for their time, but were then largely wiped out at the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction. So another one of the big five mass extinctions, in two of which bound the Triassic. So an exciting time frame by that standard. So they're part of this ecological trend. So why did they evolve in the first place? Well, for most of the dome-headed animals, some sort of agonistic interpretation has been put forward. So agonistic just refers to animal behaviors mostly within species that involve fighting members of your own species. So this can be battles for dominance, whether it be trying to get mates or trying to get territory or over food, anything like that. And among living animals, a lot of the work on agonistic behaviors is in ungulates, is in hoofed mammals. So, and we know in things like bighorn sheep and a lot of other ungulates, they will bash their heads together or slam their horns together in battles for dominance. So that has been, interpreted to be the purpose for a lot of these boneheads in the fossil record as well, to varying degrees of confidence, because of course we're not seeing any of these animals alive. But for things like the tapinocephalians, these early synapsids, there's been research looking at the orientation of the brain and reinforcement of the vertebrae of the backbone in the neck, showing that the skull was optimized for withstanding very powerful stresses coming onto the skull, consistent with sort of them bashing their heads together. For the pachycephalosaurs, there's been a lot of debate and a lot of research as to what they were doing with the domes. And it does seem like some sort of agonistic purpose underlies that. There's a lot of specimens of these actually that have been found with lesions on them that would correspond to sort of damage taken while fighting one another. Whether that was actually bashing their heads together like a sheep, or whether it was more things like flank butting, hitting the sides of the body, hitting the hips and the tail, that's unknown. To test that, we would need a lot more skeletons of pachycephalosaurs, but as I mentioned earlier, we mostly just have the skull caps. So we can't, look at 100 pachycephalosaur skeletons and see if they have broken and rehealed ribs, for instance, which would be a great indicator that they were butting the flanks rather than the skulls. And so we really don't know. And similarly, like we're not really sure if this also applies to Cranosaura and Triopticus, these Protopkynosians, because we have so little fossil record to go on with these things. So right now we have a total of 3 specimens. There's one skull roof for Triopticus, one skull roof for Cranosaura, and then a second more fragmentary part of the skull for Cranosaura. So there's no evidence, for lesions or pathologies or anything in these. We know nothing about how the neck was, whether the neck was braced for dealing with impact, whether there's any damage to the skeletons. It's a total mystery at this moment, which in some ways is very exciting, because there's a lot, shows that there's a ton left to discover among the miraculous reptiles of the Triassic.
Yeah, so that was one of my thoughts, Christian, as you were saying that, is like, well, is it better to find like a full skeleton of an animal, or is it better to, find this, as you said, a lump of a fossil that kind of lets us create like a new animal in our heads? I think that's kind of exciting. And I have a lot of other thoughts. And before we get to questions, Just a reminder, you can type in your questions into the chat and you can ask about this discovery or, reptile and amphibian paleontology. It's all on topic for today. And so, Christian, do you ever put googly eyes on your fossils, like just for fun? Because it totally looked like a googly eye on that one picture of Cranosaurus skull cap.
Some paleontologists have been known to. I do not. I do not myself. But I think especially in prep labs, it can be very helpful because you want, at least if you have a skull, you kind of want visitors to be able to understand and situate themselves with regards to the fossil, especially if it's like partially broken up, or if you just have part of the back of a skull still coming out of a rock, and just showing like where the eyeball is makes it a lot easier to interpret. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think probably, I know historically we have, maybe right now, in our prep lab at the museum, there are specimens that have googly eyes in the skull. Um, but most of the, so in the Permian, actually, a lot of the specimens are just found as isolated skulls, kind of in nodules, and it's very obvious like what they are, like what the skull is. So it's not quite as important to situate yourself.
Oh, this is one reason why I love this program is I can mention googly eyes to you and you will turn it into a sign, something that's relevant to scientific research. I think that's really cool and you make a
There's
great point.
real scientific merit to googly eyes.
Yeah. So we had a question from Amanda. How many dome heads are there out there? And I'm guessing this is species wise.
Yeah, so it varies from group to group. The like the Protopkynosians and the Chalicotheres, the number of known dome-headed species are pretty low. It's just like one or two. For Pachycephalosaurs, even though they're fairly restricted in time, we only know them from the late Cretaceous. For sure, there are some slightly earlier ones that have been arguably considered Pachycephalosaurs. But there's a lot of named Pachycephalosaurs. There's in more than 10, probably 20, although whether all of those are valid has been questioned. And then when you go back to the Permian, these tapinocephalids, the boneheaded synapsids, there's a lot of those as well. So there's like 15 or so species of the tapinocephalids, most of which actually are from one site, which is the Karoo Basin of South Africa. So if you expand to living around the world, because there are more fragmentary tapinocephalids known from Brazil and Russia as well. So they were probably pretty broadly distributed. They're probably quite a diverse group in terms of like how many species there were.
And so are most of the species that have dome heads, are they suspected to have dome heads because, they're using it for fighting like you showed with the in the last slide? Or do you think it's possible they're using it for anything else? Like I've seen dinosaurs that have like, things on their head that kind of help them communicate and make sounds to talk to each other.
Yeah,
If that's
so
possible.
a lot of these extravagant features in the fossil record, there's no reason why they couldn't have been multi-purpose. Having a structure that both had immediate physical functional uses as well as display purposes. With these things, it does seem more likely that they were actually being used for fighting than something like a duck-billed dinosaur crest. So those in a duck-billed dinosaur's crest, something like Parasaurolophus or Corythosaurus, the crest comes off the back of the skull, and it's actually the nasal cavity. So the nose like has a long tube that goes up through the crest, curls around, and then comes back in, which a number of paleontologists have interpreted as a resonating chamber for vocalization. So these things were like honking or whatever it would have been loudly and communicating with these. And then also the visual aspect of seeing this elaborate crest, would have been a display purpose. In the Protopkynosians, at least, it is solid bone. So there's not like a sinus or any cavity from the nose going up in there. There aren't even much in the way of nerves going up through there. It is really kind of a solid mass. I mean, that itself could be partially display. Like we talked about the Bernetiomorphs last month, how they have a lot of pachyostosed bones, bosses and horns.
The dragons.
Yeah, the sort of the dragon-looking synapsids. But they're elongate, but they're not super, they're not very robust, for want of a better word. Like they're very thin in places. So it seems like they would break easily if they were really like slapping their heads together. That may be more just a case of for display. But when it's just kind of like a big lump of bone, that's like seems to have evolved to absorb impact. I think agonistic sort of fighting interpretations are more valid.
Hmm. And South Lake Elementary has a question. Do
Yeah.
any of these fossils come from the museum, where we work in downtown Raleigh?
So we have a wonderful collection of Triassic fossils, many of which are on display. Especially in the Nature Research Center, we have a big display on Triassic reptiles from the Research Triangle. But we have not yet found any Protopkynosians here. So it's something actually I would love to find. If they're present, it's the right age for the North Carolina Triassic. It's also Carnian and Norian. So we know they're in Texas at this point. So they could very well be in North Carolina. And I'm going to be looking for them, when I'm out there digging. The ones that we have right now, there are some very crocodile-like creatures called phytosaurs. There are these giant amphibians, like roughly salamander-like things called metoposaurs. And then there are also these very powerful predators called Rawasuchians, which the skull I showed right back at the beginning of like archosaurs in the Triassic, that's a Rawasuchian skull. So there are a lot of these Triassic animals in our museum, but not yet a domehead.
Hmm. Oh man, that's so exciting that you could actually find one. Maybe the next time you're able to go out and do some field work.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a question about the new dome heads. How do we know that they're not? I mean, besides the fact that that ghost lineage amount of time is crazy, 140 million years, it's unlikely that it's a pachycephalosaur. But are there any other differences between the skull caps from a pachycephalosaur that you can use to compare to these
Yeah,
animals?
so in Triopticus, the brain case is preserved. So the base of the skull near the back, what's called the foramen magnum, which is just the hole in the back of your skull where basically the spinal cord goes from the brain into the vertebrae. So that part is preserved in that animal, and it is not like what you see in a dinosaur. Um, the researchers working on these also did CAT scans on them to look at the inside using X-rays, and so they were able to reconstruct what the endocast, which is just basically a model of the space where the brain would be,
Mhm.
and the internal structure of the ear. And out of those, they were actually able to see a bunch of characters that show that it's not a dinosaur. It's a more primitive type of reptile, one of these earlier archosauromorphs. So on both a time scale perspective and sort of like a strict morphology, strict shape perspective, it does not seem that these are anything to do with pachycephalosaurs.
Mhm. Very cool. And I noticed on your on one of your diagrams of it was either the fossil itself or the like the reconstruction that they did, and
Mhm.
you had things labeled like par and pit. And do those correspond to like areas of the brain?
Oh yeah. Hold on, let me go back to that just a moment. So yeah, so in these figures, so the part of the skull that this it represents is what's called the frontoparietal region. So our skulls are made up of a bunch of different bones that variably fuse together as we're growing up. And two of the major bones of the vertebrate skull roof are the frontal, which is sort of like above the eye sockets, and then the parietal, which is above the brain. Um, and so in the dome-headed animals, these have fused basically imperceptibly together into a single frontal parietal mass. And what's being illustrated here is just kind of a rough idea of where these bones would have been in life. So the ones labeled FR, that's the frontal region, PAR is the parietal region. Um, Another thing you can see labeled here, if you look at the figure on the left, and then in the bottom right, there's something labeled PIT, and it points at a hole in the middle of the skull. And that's actually the pineal foramen. So that's the third eye that reptiles have. So it's a light sensitive organ. It's not a true eye in the sense that it's able to show images. like the main eyes are, but it does contain photosensitive cells and is present. It's still in some living reptiles. It's in some lizards and the tuatara, but that eye has been lost in like mammals and in other reptile lineages. Especially if you're endothermic, if you're warm-blooded, you don't really need the pineal eye anymore, it seems. But another interesting thing with that actually is in these animals, the pineal eye is pointed backwards away from the main section of the dome. And that's something that has been argued in tapinocephalids as well. So that's the one sort of like soft bit of the top of the skull where it would have had the pineal organ and the pineal gland in there. And you don't want those being damaged if you're bashing your skull together. So having that pineal eye opening backwards away from the dome is consistent with sort of an agonistic behavior for these things.
Mm-hmm. All right, awesome. And we have a question that I think is more about dinosaurs. So taking it.
That's fine. Dinosaurs are reptiles. We can go.
Yeah. All right. So Miranda asks, what types are chickens related to?
So, I mean, chickens, the dinosaurs they're most closely related to are other pheasants.
Oh no, too technical.
Well, I mean, to
no.
get deeper into the question a little bit, so individual groups of birds didn't evolve from different types of dinosaurs. So all living birds share a common ancestor and are more closely related to other birds than to any particular dinosaur species that we know of. The common ancestor of all birds arose sometime in the Jurassic period from something more or less, I'm not saying it's the direct ancestor, like Archaeopteryx, which itself is most related to the like so-called raptor dinosaurs, things like Velociraptor, things like Troodon, that were living at that time. So chicken insofar as like what dinosaur is it related to, be it chicken, be it ostrich, be it swan, be it crow, any living bird is most closely related to the raptor dinosaurs among sort of like the iconic Mesozoic taxa.
Mm-hmm. All right, awesome. And Zaria from South Lake wants to know, how long did it take to find that fossil? I'm thinking this is for Cranosaur.
Yeah, so for Cranosaura, it was the excavations in the Malari Formation went on for a while, but like finding that specimen itself, I think, was actually quite quick because it's a sort of thing that is found as what we call float when we're working in the field. So there's either specimens found in situ, which is where they're in the rock and you have to dig them out. But a lot of sites also, you just kind of like walk around where fossils are eroding out of the dirt. And if you find a loose bone, you just pick it up and that's what's called float. So Cranosaura is in that kind of situation. So mere seconds to actually collect it. However, years of work on Cuddy's part, understanding the geology and doing the prospecting in order to find the sites, work the localities. And then decades before it had real paleontological attention, and then several more decades in order to figure out its relationships by studying things like Triopticus. So paleontology can be a quite protracted process. It can take a long time. So, you know, Cranosaura has been, various aspects of it have been worked for, you know, going on 50 years or so. And it's, it can take a long time.
It's crazy. When you said decades again to figure out the relationship, I was like, what? I'm looking at that. That's a long, long time.
You know, that's one of the bad things about like real mystery fossils is as scientists, we don't like to publish until we are fairly confident of our conclusions. Like we don't just necessarily throw out wild hypotheses without testing them.
Yeah.
So when you have something where you have very little to go on, you might not necessarily want to just like publish it right away. You want to find more bones, more evidence. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can take a long time.
Yeah, no, but that makes sense, right? Don't just be willy-nilly about it. So Christian, I'm going to set a timer. Well, I'm going to mark this date and this time. And when you finally find a dome-headed Triassic reptile from North Carolina, we're going to be like, what's happening? Yeah. Have a party.
Hopefully, if I discover it and dig it up. Give me, let's say, 5 years to get it out there.
Okay. Oh man, so exciting. Okay, so let's look again at these questions. We've got some great ones in here. Okay, so Anne wants to know, why would a third eye help these reptiles?
Yeah, so the pineal eye is actually, it's a very ancient structure in vertebrates in general. So I mean, it goes all the way back even before land animals necessarily. Um, and basically what it does, the pineal organ serves a lot of purposes. So like we mammals still have a pineal organ even though we don't have the eye. So the pineal in us has become the pineal gland, which is kind of in the center base part of the brain, very close to the pituitary gland. And what the pineal organ does for us now is it secretes melatonin, which is a chemical that regulates our sleep patterns. Um, and what are called circadian rhythms, which is just basically our activity levels through our lives. Um, and so in ancient animals and also in lizards today that have the pineal eye, it also helps regulate body rhythms, sort of cycles of activity. But because those animals are cold-blooded and are reliant on the sun to warm them up in order to move around, they need to know basically when the sun is out immediately in the morning in order to crawl up out of their burrows or out from under a leaf or out from under bark and start soaking up rays so they have the energy to go eat food or mate or whatever they're doing. Um, so for animals like that, having like extremely photosensitive cells in basically this eye that is always open because there isn't an eyelid on the pineal eye, um, that the second photons from the sun start hitting it, they're like, oh, gotta go, start, getting ready for the day. Um, and so it's in the Permian and the Triassic also, it was a time of climatic extremes. So broad desert belts would have been hot days, cold nights sometimes. So they really need to maximize their activity during certain times of the day. So I think it would have been very important for them just to sort of regulate their schedules, basically.
Mm-hmm. It just seems so convenient to, uh, I mean, obviously we can sense the sunlight and, that adds into our circadian rhythms and we're able to wake up better with sunlight, but just sunlight, instant, I'm awake, I'm up, woo, ready to go. And I've seen that on bearded dragons. We have those as animal ambassadors at the museum, and I've definitely seen that kind of in the center of their head between their eyes,
Yep.
but at the top. Yeah, so that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. And Katrina said melatonin is a wonderful thing. I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. Let's see. South Lake wants to know, how does weathering and erosion affect the process of finding fossils?
Well, it is a huge part of paleontological fieldwork because if the ground didn't erode, we'd never find them. We don't have any technology for just like looking through solid rock, seeing what's underground. So uh, some sites, it is human activity that breaks open the rock. Like here in North Carolina, most of the fieldwork that I do is in quarries. Where there's mining activity going on that is exposing the fossiliferous layers because in general, the habitats here are more forested, they're more grassland, so there isn't much exposed rock at the surface. In places where there is exposed rock, thinking about deserts, thinking about mountains, a lot of the classic fossil localities, whether it be the Karoo Basin in South Africa or the Sahara Desert or the Rocky Mountains out west, where there are all these amazing dinosaur fossils. Those are basically the raw rock. And unless a fossil just happens to be at the surface, you're not going to find it. So year to year, as wind and rain wear down, erode the surface, new fossils are always exposed. So we can revisit the same exact field site year to year and find new things. And a lot of paleontological fieldwork is based on that idea that if we keep going back to an area that we know have fossils, more fossils will eventually be exposed. The rate at which that occurs is very variable. There are areas out west that get rain, maybe a few inches a year, and are in, pretty hot areas that are not really erosive landscapes, so they're not eroding very quickly. And enough rock to expose a fossil is happening on decadal time scales. So years and years and years and years before any new fossils are exposed. Then there are sites that, are in like rain heavy areas where fossils are coming out of relatively loose soil. So fossils that have been sort of already are getting into dirt, into sand, where one heavy rain can completely wash away the surface of a gully and expose a whole skeleton. And there you really need to be right on top of it and paying attention. Otherwise, you can lose the fossil.
But how lucky that would be, you know?
Oh yeah, and I mean it happens, all the time. Whenever paleontologists are out there,
Hmm.
generally find
All
something.
right. So are birds of prey like eagles actually raptors?
Yes, so there is a it's become confusing. I was reticent even earlier when I said raptor dinosaurs. It has sort of become the common term for them. Those are dromaeosaurs and troodontids, the Deinonychosaurs in general, because they were nicknamed raptors in Jurassic Park after Velociraptor. The formal technical use of the term raptor is solely for birds of prey. So falcons, hawks, eagles, owls, those sorts of things. Um, and the dinosaur term has sort of been grandfathered in, and some of us will use it begrudgingly. But yes, birds of prey are the true raptors.
Right. Okay. So I think we're probably going to wrap it up pretty soon here, but I just wanted to know, Christian, if you could give us, since it's reptile and amphibian days,
Mhm.
if you could give us maybe like a brief overview of how prehistoric amphibians fit into this picture. And, maybe if we've had any old news topics that kind of cover amphibians at all, we can point people in that direction. I know we don't have, an hour to talk about amphibians, but
Yeah, I mean, amphibians are a huge part of the story. So it's not, sometimes people think of amphibians as being more primitive than reptiles and birds and mammals, but they're all sort of like equally successful parts of the modern world. Amphibians are still super diverse. More species of salamander here in North Carolina than anywhere in the world, and more species than like a lot of other groups of animals that are here
Mhm.
that we consider fairly successful. So amphibians, they've been around longer than reptiles. So they go all the way back to, depending on how you want to define them, um, the Carboniferous or even the Devonian, to the earliest tetrapods that are crawling up onto land. Whether you
How
really,
long ago is
so
that?
that's getting more than 300 million years ago.
Wow.
Um, and we have talked about some of those. We've talked about some of the early tetrapods in particular, sort of the fin to limb transition. So going from something that if we looked at it nowadays, we'd call it a fish, to something where if we looked at it, we'd sort of squint and say, no, that's more of an amphibian. It's a very blurry line, as it's during the transformation series there as they're evolving. Um, but in the Triassic, where these boneheads were living, there were some of these giant amphibians that I mentioned before, metoposaurs. There's another group called capitosaurs that is equally as large or larger. And when I say they're big, I mean, we're getting to 5 meters, getting to the 15 to 20 foot long amphibian range. Um, so there's a lot of diversity too. Like some of them, uh, we talked a lot about marine reptiles, or at least made mention of them. And there were in the early Triassic, there's also marine amphibians. So we think about amphibians today having very permeable skin that can't handle being in salt water. One, that's not entirely true. It's mostly true, but there are even some frogs today that can deal with sort of estuarine water. Um, but it seems like these animals called trematosaurs in the Triassic were fully adapted to marine life, and we're just living out in near shore sea environments, eating fish. So they had very long snouts that looked more like crocodiles than they would any amphibian living today. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity in the Triassic. And then we don't know as much about the Mesozoic, later Mesozoic and Cenozoic fossil records of the modern amphibian groups, which are frogs, salamanders, and caecilians, only because they're fairly small by comparison and their bones are very delicate. So where we do have good fossils of them, it's usually in exceptional preservation systems.
Mhm.
Like there are a lot of great salamander fossils known from the same beds in China in the Yahol group that produce the feathered dinosaurs, just
And we've
because
talked about that a lot.
yeah, the preservation is so good.
Mhm.
So a lot of our understanding of salamander evolution comes from just those sites. Because other than that, it's usually like isolated vertebrae, isolated bits of bone. Um, I will say there are some very cool salamanders that coexisted with Triceratops and T-Rex that we're hoping to find more of as part of the Cretaceous Creatures program with our dueling dinosaurs work. Um, there's a salamander in particular called Habrosaurus, which is like a giant siren. So the sirens are native to southeastern U.S. Several different species. There's one at the museum in the living collections that's I consider a good friend that I always like to stop by and visit. And they get pretty big. They get a few feet long. But in the Cretaceous, there are some like really huge by proportion siren salamanders. Like we're talking things that may be over 3 feet long, thicker than your forearm, sort of things. Um,
Wow.
that may have been, you know, being eaten by some of the smaller carnivorous dinosaurs alive at the time,
Mhm.
but also only found as isolated bones. So we haven't found a complete skeleton of the Habrosaurus,
Mhm.
but something that again we hope to find as we do more work in
Yeah.
in Hell Creek in the late Cretaceous.
So that's exciting. Yeah, I mean, it's always exciting to think like just the vastness of the fossil record,
Yeah,
what's left to find.
untold thousands left to be found of fossils out there.
Yeah.
Well,
All right.
millions of all kinds of fossils, but thousands of select vertebrate fossils.
Yeah. I know, right? We haven't even touched on plants or really
Yeah,
invertebrates yet on old news in particular. So
that's where you get to the millions level, because like when you think of how many like fossil leaves have been fossilized over time,
mhm.
it's a huge number.
Well, we have one more question from TLC over in
Okay.
Statesville. Is Titanoboa a dinosaur?
Titanoboa is a proper boa. So it is a snake. It is a member of the same family Boidae of the modern boa constrictor and the anaconda. So it was, you can think of it as dinosaur sized. It was one of the largest snakes of all time. But it's a true snake, not a dinosaur, and it lived during the so-called age of mammals. So it lived early on in the Cenozoic era, after the extinction of the non-bird dinosaurs in the Cretaceous. So there was a brief period, what's called the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum in the Cenozoic, before glaciers really took off, uh, where global temperatures were quite high. Um, it was a period of like very rapid global warming, which is distressingly similar to what is happening today. But in any case, it was good for reptiles at that time, not so good for mammals. But reptiles really, you saw them get giant again for a brief period of time. So you have Titanoboa, you have these giant turtles like Stupendomes that would have been, turtles with shells 12 feet in diameter. You had these like 30 to 40-foot long crocodiles that were living at that time. So there was sort of a last gasp of mega reptiles during this part of the age of mammals as well.
Very cool. And Anne has a question. Are new fossils being found due to drought from climate change?
Um, yes and no. So there are, as ice caps melt, in Antarctica, we will probably see additional fossils exposed there. Um, there's a lot of the droughts happening today, haven't exposed any particular fossil localities. Um, what you might see in the news related to that is mostly archaeological sites. So there's been in England and also in Central America, there have been cases of like bad droughts that kill off basically all the surface vegetation and have exposed ancient temple complexes, or megaliths like Stonehenge-esque like settlements or forts, but not so much for paleontology, at least that I know of.
Mhm. Well, that's really interesting. And that is all the time we have left today for old news. So, Christian, thank you, of course, for sharing your expertise with
No,
us.
Pleasure to
And to everyone who joined us, thank you so much. I want to give a special congratulations to South Lake Elementary, virtual high fives for all your bingo wins. And of course, anyone else who played bingo, learned some new words,
go
and
South Lake.
yeah. And I have I guess a fun assignment, hopefully for some of you, if you're interested. Take a look at Cranosaura and see, if all we have is that one lump, come up with your own creature. What do you think it looked like? Where do you think it lived? Because the world is your oyster, right? With this mysterious specimen. And mark your calendars, everybody, for April 13th. That is our next episode of Old News. Of course, we don't know what the news will bring. So if you register, you can get a reminder email that's got the link to join the program, old news bingo cards, and of course a topic description so you can decide if you're interested, if you want to watch. All right, I think I hit everything. Thank you everyone for joining, and check out the Reptile and Amphibian Day events calendar. There might be some other topics that you'd love to check out. We've got definitely some on salamander. We've got a lot on salamanders. So because that's our theme this week. Yeah. So thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks. Stay safe out there.
Yeah. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.